As a result of having this low-functioning social-emotional brain, I have this thing called mind blindness. In other words, I have a hard time predicting what might be in the mind of my partner or spouse. I have a hard time imagining what they might be thinking or feeling. So I truly have no clue how the other person feels and thinks. So as a result, when they have a perspective or opinion that's different from mine, I can't wrap my brain around their perspective. I can't, in a sense, peel myself out of my body and crawl into her body and look through her eyes and see things through her lens. So if I have this mind blindness, her viewpoint makes utter nonsense to me. So since I'm blind to her perspective, I will tend to view her differing opinion as she's disagreeing with me. She's trying to argue with me, which is a thinking error. So I make this thinking error because she is disagreeing with me, therefore she's against me. I make that leap of logic right there. So then I continue with another thinking error. Because she's against me, I have to defend myself and prove that she's wrong and illogical and overly emotional. If I don't make her wrong, that means I'm wrong because only one person can be right. And that must be me, since my perception is the only perception I can see. Emphasis on see, because I have mind blindness and I can't see hers. So in other words, since I can't comprehend her thoughts or feelings, her thoughts and feelings are not valid. Okay? So it's like, think of color blindness perhaps, where I'm colorblind. I have the Asperger's and I'm colorblind. I only see in shades of gray. And the NT wife, for example, she sees this rich mosaic picture and she's pointing out all the colors. And she says blue, red, well, look at that pretty turquoise and that. And I'm going, no, that's just all gray. And then we get into this argument because I have my filter and she has her filter. And since I can't see through her eyes and see all the different colors, I just assumed quite honestly that she's just a nutcase and doesn't even know what she's talking about. And I totally invalidate her opinion at that point.
Everybody with Asperger's syndrome or high-functioning autism is different, and so the traits manifest differently given the person, and also it varies from situation to situation. But most Asperger's-related behavior, sometimes misinterpreted by the NT spouse or partner as insensitivity, tends to revolve around the Asperger's individual's resistance to any kind of change. So it would be helpful to think in terms of when your husband is like really super resistant to any type of change, that's usually a sign that it's related to an Asperger's trait. So an Asperger's individual is resistant to change for many reasons. For example, he has anxiety about a current or upcoming event. Due to mind blindness, he has a general misunderstanding of how the real world works. He tends to have difficulty understanding the actions and feelings of someone else. And your husband may have some other issues going on. A very prominent one is ADD. He may be resistant to change because he's reluctant to participate in an activity he can't do perfectly or an activity that is too difficult. Most people with Asperger's do have a strong need to control the situation, and they typically have difficulty transitioning to another activity, especially if the current activity is not finished. So any or all of these triggers can result in certain behavioral patterns that look like insensitivity and selfishness. For example, he may argue, he may have an adult tantrum, he may melt down, he may refuse to listen to you, he may pout, and so on. But keep in mind that Asperger's syndrome is a developmental disorder. So developmentally, he is challenged, and what I mean by that, his social emotional brain is immature compared to his chronological age. Also, the triggers that I listed, these triggers have more to do with anxiety and rigidity than it does, just wanting to upset you or hurt you. The typical Asperger's brain does not take in what is going on around him. He's not able to read between the lines. He doesn't understand implied directions, doesn't understand social cues, doesn't understand facial expression or body language. And so all of this does kind of give the appearance as if he doesn't care. And in many cases, it may give the appearance that he's purposely trying to be hurtful. So uncovering triggers for negative behaviors is very important. It would be good for him to keep a diary, or maybe you could keep the diary noting any events surrounding negative behaviors, the details of his responses, and so on. And this is not to get him off the hook. He's still responsible for his behavior, and having a developmental disorder is not a license to hurt other people. Having said that, people with Asperger's syndrome are often unable to resist giving into their obsessions and compulsions. Because they have difficulty interpreting social cues, they can come off as being egocentric. It's difficult for them to fully appreciate what impact their behaviors have on others. And due to trouble handling changes in routine, even a simple variation in your husband's schedule or routine may be enough to cause him to have a rage attack or a meltdown or a shutdown. So to summarize, when you're trying to decide the difference between Asperger's related behavior versus pure insensitivity, that has nothing to do with the disorder, it would be helpful to think in terms of the fact that he is resistant to change, he prefers routine and predictability, and when that gets disrupted, his behavior that looks like insensitivity is probably mostly related to Asperger's syndrome. With mind blindness, you're not really sure what other people are feeling, what they're thinking, what their motives might be, and so they're always trying to guess what's going on with other people in the social realm. And this is very anxiety-provoking. And so that's why they really love routine and predictability, to cut down on the guesswork involved with trying to figure out how people operate. So therefore, they're very resistant to change, and they do have some dysfunctional coping mechanisms to deal with their anxiety around change that can look like insensitivity. So we need to look at two things, really: mind blindness and alexithymia. Now, these are two traits that are often found in Asperger's and high-functioning autism. You can think of mind blindness as the inability to predict the beliefs and intentions of others, and you can think of alexithymia as the inability to identify and interpret emotional signals in others and also in one's self. And this, in turn, reduces the ability to be empathically attuned to others. So let's look at each of these in turn. We'll look at mind blindness first. So mind blindness is essentially the opposite of empathy, and it can be described as an inability to develop an awareness of what's in the mind of another person. The typical brain, for example, let's say you are talking to somebody and they have a certain facial expression and they have certain body language and they have a certain tone of voice, and you're weighing all that in conjunction with their actual words, and you may be able to be pretty good at predicting, how that person is feeling or what they're thinking or what their general attitude is. Well, people with mind blindness, they don't have that ability. So generally speaking, people with mind blindness are delayed in developing what is called a theory of mind. Another way of saying this is the person with mind blindness can't conceptualize, understand, or predict emotional states in other people. Now, alexithymia can be described as a state of deficiency in understanding, processing, or describing emotions. The person with alexithymia, they have trouble imagining outcomes. They have difficulty predicting how their behavior is going to impact others. They have trouble describing feelings to other people. They're not sure how they feel. They're not sure how you feel. They have difficulty identifying feelings and distinguishing between feelings and the bodily sensations associated with those feelings. Now, there's two kinds of alexithymia. There's what is called primary alexithymia, and we'll just call it an ongoing psychological trait that does not alter over time, and that speaks to the business of the Asperger's brain being hardwired. That is something that can't be fixed. But then there's secondary alexithymia, and that is a state-dependent situation. And it usually disappears after the evoking stressful situation has changed. So that second version of alexithymia depends on the situation. Now, the typical deficiencies that result from alexithymia, as I mentioned a little bit ago, can include a lack of imagination, lack of intuition, lack of empathy, and it also results in the person with Asperger's being more driven towards relating to objects and tasks rather than people. Additionally, it would be concrete, realistic, logical thinking, often to the exclusion of emotional responses to problems. You may find that your Asperger's man is highly logical. There's few dreams or fantasies due to this business of having a restricted imagination. They may treat themselves as robots. They have problems identifying, describing, and working with one's own feelings. And they have a real problem identifying, describing, and working with their partner's feelings. So alexithymia creates interpersonal problems because these individuals avoid emotionally close relationships. Or if they do form relationships with others, they tend to position themselves in either a dependent, dominant, or impersonal position. And the reason they do that is because they want the relationship to remain superficial. A secondary issue related to alexithymia involves the inability to identify and modulate strong emotions. And that's usually with the Asperger's man, anger. And so the inability to modulate emotions leaves the person prone to sudden affective outbursts such as rage, meltdowns, or in some cases, shutdowns. So if your situation is like most that I hear about, it's not uncommon for your husband to go into meltdowns. Looks like an adult version of a temper tantrum, raging and being very critical of you. So in most cases, the individual with Asperger's is having a lot of anxiety, and they want to release that anxiety because anxiety is nothing more than a bunch of pent-up, uncomfortable emotions. And so they tend to want to have a verbal vomit on their partner to discharge this uncomfortable, anxious feeling. And unfortunately, when they discharge their anger and their anxiety onto their partner, they feel better, but their partner now feels like shit, quite honestly, because they've been used as a scapegoat and a whipping post. Oftentimes, when the Asperger's person goes into the meltdown or rage, they will report a feeling of being unwillingly detached from the world. In other words, they feel a disconnect, and it's like they didn't really volunteer for this disconnect. It can just look like a pure case of emotional abuse to the observer, but what's really going on is the Asperger's, in this case, Asperger's man, is having a real internal struggle, and he's trying to figure out a way to discharge this anxiety, and unfortunately this is done in a very dysfunctional way. It's his destructive coping mechanism. Now, people with mind blindness and alexithymia, when they become an adult, they do have great difficulty finding a life partner or getting married due to poor social skills. Because if you have mind blindness and you're not really attuned to what other people might be feeling, and you struggle with empathy, and if you have alexithymia, which you're in a situation where you're almost overly logical, clearly you can understand why that would get in the way of social skills. And a relationship is, by definition, exchanging social interaction. The complexity and inconsistency of the social world often poses extreme challenges to individuals with this mind blindness and alexithymia business. So that doesn't necessarily help you feel better, but it may help you understand the deficits that your husband has that appear to make him selfish, uncaring, insensitive. That's what it looks like, and that's what it feels like, and that's totally understandable. However, if you look deeper, you will realize that indeed there is some brain wiring that is different that prevents him from relating to you in a more loving, compassionate way. Oftentimes, when you see the ugly side of your husband, what's really going on inside him is he's struggling to comprehend what's going on in a problematic situation, and also dealing with the anxiety associated with not being able to comprehend what's going on in a social situation.